Good evening, everyone. I'm Eve Kahn. I'm head of the Groyer Club Special Functions Committee. I love this job because I get to bring the most fascinating speakers, making groundbreaking discoveries about the history of the printed word and the handwritten word and image throughout eons and how we communicate across time and space. I love the caliber of the speakers that we get is astonishing at this unique hybrid clubhouse, museum, and library. So welcome everyone. Thank you all for coming, and thanks to the hundreds of people signed up online. My job here this evening is simply to introduce our introducer for this fascinating talk about medieval monastic manuscript culture that's drawn from a book for sale here this evening that's rivetingly fascinating and spectacularly beautiful by Andrew Jotischky. And remember, people, it's October and the holidays are just around the corner, and you must know someone who needs a book. Sorry, it's November. Thank you, Caroline. Caroline is our in-house fact checker. Yes, moving right along. So I'm just introducing our glorious introducer, our first star this evening. Gillian Adler is Esther Rauschenbusch Chair in Humanities and Associate Professor of Literature at Sarah Lawrence College, where she teaches medieval literature. Books that she authored, co-authored, or edited include Chaucer and the Ethics of Time, Time and Medieval Life, and Cultural History of Time in the Middle Ages. And she's president of the New York Medieval Society, which has co-sponsored this evening. So, in addition to this stellar resume, you should know that on a regular basis, I get an email from Gillian that says, somebody's made some amazing new discoveries in the medieval realm. You know, would you be interested in a special functions talk on this? She sends me an email out of the blue, and I open up the links that she sent, and I go, because I'm absolutely blown away at what people she knows are discovering about the medieval world, how medieval people thought, slept, traveled, wrote, documented their experiences, and how much of their world echoes in our own. And then an event ensues that enlightens everyone and packs the house like tonight's. So Gillian, I'm so grateful to know you and to see the springboard that you are for events like tonight's. Thank you for all you do for the field, and welcome back to the podium. I think this is our third event together. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you to Eve for her always generous introduction, and for her and April Rose's support in organizing this event, to the Groyer Club, of course, for hosting us, and to this wonderful audience for joining us for this event on medieval manuscripts and the monastic world. I am Gillian Adler, the president of the New York Medieval Society, and we are delighted to have co-sponsored this event to bring the illuminating research of Professor Andrew Jotischky on monasticism in the Middle Ages to the New York community. The New York Medieval Society, just a few words about it. It's a New York-based foundation dedicated to supporting cultural institutions, scholars, teachers, and students invested in medieval studies, and particularly the intellectual, spiritual, and artistic history of the period 500 to 1500. Circa 500 to 1500. To give you a sense of our recent activities in the past couple of months, we have proudly supported key projects, including Professor Matilda Bruckner's new book on Jewish-Christian dialogue in medieval French literature, and Professor Robert Maxwell's forthcoming volume on medieval illuminated cartularies. We helped sponsor the latest exhibition at Le Musée de Cluny in Paris on the Middle Ages of the 19th century, fakes and creations in the precious arts, and the symposium to commemorate the legacy of Peggy A.R. Brown at the University of Pennsylvania. The New York Medieval Society also collaborated a few weeks ago with the London Medieval Society to host a symposium on 19th century medievalism, so it's a popular theme this fall. Tonight, I'm very pleased to welcome Andrew Jotischky, whose erudite and comprehensive book, The Monastic World, A 1200-Year History, published by Yale in 2024, will be the center of his talk and our conversation this evening. Professor of Medieval History at Royal Holloway, University of London, he specializes in medieval religious culture, including monasticism, pilgrimage, and devotion, as well as the broader history of medieval Europe, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Crusades. Like the geographic scope of his subject matter, his published work is extensive, ranging from subjects of Jacques de Vitry and Matthew Paris to the symbolism of lions in the Holy Land, but I'll just mention his significant monographs include Latin and Greek monasticism in the Crusader states, published by Cambridge University Press, The Carmelites in Antiquity, Mendicants and Their Pasts in the Middle Ages, published by Oxford, Crusading in the Crusader States, published by Longman, and he did the Penguin Historical Atlas of the Medieval World. And there's a longer list of publications and accomplishments, but we must save time for his talk. Our event now merges the central interests of the New York Medieval Society and the Grolier Club, which are medieval studies and the history of the book. It also relates to a broader interest in New York right now in the kinds of spiritual books people were reading, as demonstrated by both the Jewish Worlds Illuminated exhibition right here in this room at the Grolier and the current Morgan Library exhibition on the Psalms in medieval art and life, both magnificent shows, and the second of which at the Morgan is particularly interested in monastic reading practices and the sacred page. The texts, letters, and records that circulated within and between monasteries raise fascinating questions about book production, learning, and scholarship, the survival of ancient texts through medieval hands and print at the end of the Middle Ages, and the balance between monks' intellectual and contemplative lives. So we are truly honored to have Professor Jotischky as our guest, our expert, and our guide this evening as we focus on this vital connection between books and monastic life. Please welcome Andrew Jotischky.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Gillian, and thank you also for the invitation to come and speak to you. Thank you to the New York Medieval Society and to the Grolier Club. It's wonderful to be here. For over 1,000 years, monasteries were institutions of unparalleled influence and authority in the European world. They were institutions of power. They were shapers and reshapers of landscapes, literally, often enablers of an agricultural revolution. But they were also places of the creation of remarkably fine, subtle, and delicate works, books. And what I was trying to do in my book, The Monastic World, was to address some of the paradoxes of medieval monasticism. To look at institutions that were part of a wider world, part of a network of power relations, but also centered on themselves, centered on and focused on the development of spirituality. I was also trying to address what I thought was a gap in scholarship on medieval monasticism, to look in parallel at monasticism in the Eastern Mediterranean alongside Western Europe. Because most histories of monasticism, of which of course there are several, most histories of medieval monasticism have tended to start off with monastic origins in the Eastern Mediterranean, wherever they locate it, Egypt, the Holy Land, Syria. And then to move to the West, to consider the Rule of Benedict, which is the foundational document for much of Western monasticism in the Middle Ages, and then to forget that monasticism in the Eastern Mediterranean continued in a different but parallel tradition. So what I was trying to do in the book was to show how monasticism across the Mediterranean and Western European world continued to evolve and develop in parallel as well as in tension with each other. So I'm going to offer just a few reflections in this talk on monasteries and book production. And I'm aware that I'm speaking to an audience that in some ways is far more expert than I am in book production. And also that it's an area that I didn't really have a chance to address fully, or to focus on as fully as it deserves in the book. I wanted to start with a contrast between two monks active in England, one English, the other French, separated by 500 years. On the left, Benedict Biscop, the abbot and founder of Wearmouth and Jarrow in Northumbria, the great centres of early English monasticism. And on the right, Henry of Blois, brother of King Stephen in the middle of the 12th century, a Cluniac monk, prior of the monastery of Cluny, before becoming Bishop of Winchester, the richest diocese in England in the 12th century. Both visited Rome in discharging their duties, and both returned from Rome with treasures for their local churches. But whereas Henry was criticized for bringing back pagan statues to adorn the episcopal palace in Winchester, in 680, almost 500 years earlier, the treasures that Benedict Biscop brought back from Rome were books, including the as yet little known Rule of Benedict, probably the first copy of the Rule of Benedict in England. He started a library for his monks at Wearmouth. That's what survives of the monastery. And when one reads Bede's account of Benedict, it's easy to miss the significance of what was happening with that gift of books. Because as Benedict understood, without books, there was effectively no monastic community. Reading is integral to monasticism in both the Western and Eastern traditions. The Rule of Benedict specifies that monks and nuns should both listen to reading and engage in lectio divina, contemplative reading themselves. Idleness is the enemy of the soul, as the rule says at one point. Therefore, the brothers or sisters should be occupied at certain times in manual labor and again at fixed hours in sacred reading. And this injunction to read was repeated throughout the Middle Ages. So just taking England as an example, in 1277, in 1343, in 1444, the statutes of the English Benedictines reiterated that monastic superiors should set monks or nuns to reading, study, writing, correcting, illuminating, and binding books. So the complete work, the complete sort of production of a book. And not only in the West. The 11th century Byzantine monastic founder, Nikon, required his monastery near Antioch to own certain specified books. The life of Pachomius, the Egyptian founding father of monasticism in the 4th century. John Cassian's Conferences, St. Basil the Great's ascetic treatises, and canons and decrees of various councils. Now, reading, an injunction to read, obviously presupposes that there are books to be read, and that means that books have to be provided by or for the community. And there are basically two ways that could happen: acquisition through purchase or gift, or making the book yourself through copying. And most monastic book production was not in the form of original composition, but rather copying existing books for the use of the library. Now, it goes without saying that in order to have something to copy, you first need to have the book. And letters between monks in different monasteries attest to the importance of organizing book loans, and indeed the frequency of book loans, underlying which was the assumption that monastic libraries could only be developed and maintained if communities were prepared to loan books for the purpose of copying. If we take just one example of a monastic text known and used across the Christian world in the Middle Ages, the monastic rules of St. Basil. We know of copies made at monasteries as far afield as the Holy Land, Syria, Cyprus, southern Italy, France, and England from the 10th to the 13th centuries. So networks between communities are being created through this process of loans. Sometimes loans were made for reasons other than simply the need to copy. I mentioned Nikon, the 11th century Byzantine founder of a monastery near Antioch. Toward the end of the 11th century, some of the manuscripts from that region, from monasteries in that region, were sent to monasteries in Damascus for safekeeping during the Seljuk conquest of North Syria. So books are regarded as being treasures that have to be protected. Books were also, in some circumstances, acquired by chance in situations of crisis. And this is an example here. This is Oxford Barocci 238, a manuscript forming part of a 12-volume set called a Menologion, a calendar of saints' lives. This is an 11th century manuscript, mid-11th century, made in Constantinople for a monastery in the Judean desert, and a collection which was evidently lost or dispersed as part of the plunder when the monastery was sacked in the 13th century. One of the surviving volumes has a colophon in it, a marginal note that tells us that that volume was subsequently purchased, and the colophon actually uses the word ransomed. The book was ransomed by a Greek monk in Acre and given to the monastery of St. John Prodromos by the Jordan. So the book undergoes a transformation in ownership, but it's also regarded as being, as having character, as being almost a personality that has to be ransomed. In some monastic communities, copying books was the primary focus of the community. So Cassiodorus's monastery at Vivarium, founded in Italy in the early 6th century, envisaged copying as an integral part of the monastic work, the work that monks were doing daily. Copying or making manuscripts was also important in some monasteries in the Orthodox world, in the Eastern Mediterranean. For example, throughout the medieval period, at St. Saba in the Judean desert, southeast of Jerusalem, that's shown there on the left, and at the Enclaistra, the monastery founded by Neophytos in Cyprus, from which about 30 manuscripts survive from the 12th or 13th centuries. And I put up on that slide, on the right-hand side, the frontispiece of Robert Curzon's visits to monasteries in the Levant, because a journey that he undertook in the 1830s, because he spent a lot of his time on that journey visiting monasteries in order to buy, borrow, beg, or sometimes probably pilfer manuscripts from them and bring them back where they're now in the British Library. But even for monastic communities without much pretension to learning, certain books were always necessary, primarily liturgical service books, antiphonary, saints' lives, or in the Orthodox world, menologia for saints' feast days. Now, it wasn't only monks, of course, who were involved in the business of book production. Nuns made manuscripts as well. In 735, Boniface of Crediton, early English missionary working in Germany amongst the then unconverted Saxons, wrote to Eadburh, abbess of Minster Thanet in Essex, asking that her community, quote, write for me in gold the epistles of St. Peter, and I'm going to send the gold for writing this. The nuns of Barking, another convent in Essex, were amongst Bede's correspondents and supplied him with material for his ecclesiastical history. This manuscript it's usually thought to be Hildegard of Bingen herself, depicted writing. And writing not in a book, but on a wax tablet. And I may mention that again in a few minutes. So I want to turn then to say a few words about the process of creating a manuscript in a monastery or a convent, and to think about some of the practical implications of bookmaking for the community. So first, the materials needed for making a book. Parchment or vellum, obviously, sheep or sheepskin, goatskin, calfskin, depending on where you are and what's most available. As you can see, the animal skin is treated, it's soaked, the hair, fur is scraped off it, and then it's stretched on a board. So amongst the equipment, amongst the necessary materials needed before you can even start making the book, are obviously the animal skins, bone for a stylus for writing on a tablet, feathers, usually goose feathers for a quill, wooden boards for making the wax tablets, cord for binding the sheets of vellum or parchment, and of course ink, usually black or brown for the writing, made according to different recipes, sometimes from tree bark or oak galls. Let's think for a moment about what that meant in practical terms. Are all these things available all the time? Well, animal skins and leather were available, most available, after the animals had been slaughtered. Typically, that's before winter, when you don't want to keep animals in pasture over winter because there isn't enough for them to graze on, and feeding them in barns is expensive. So the animals from which vellum is made tended to be slaughtered before the winter season. So the influx of writing materials tends to be seasonal. And that also has implications for other material needs. As the days get darker, naturally more light is needed. Monasteries needed a lot of artificial light in any case. Candles had to be kept burning in the church and the dormitory. But scriptoria, the places where writing is done, also needed light, and hence a need for huge quantities of wax for candles. And wax is also needed, of course, for the tablets that were used for rough drafts of writing, as in that image of Hildegard. Eadmer, in his Life of Anselm, the early 12th century, describes how Anselm, as abbot of Bec, composed first by writing on a wax tablet with the bone stylus before having this copied out by a scribe. Now, wax obviously comes from beehives, and we know that monasteries were dedicated apiarists. But I don't know if there are any apiarists in the audience. If there are, you'll know that far more honey is produced from wax from a typical bee colony, which is actually the inverse of what a monastery needs. The monastery needs wax in huge quantities. It doesn't need so much honey. And pre-18th century methods of beekeeping in both East and West were destructive to hives because before frame beekeeping had been invented, at the end of every season, in order to obtain the wax and honey from a hive, the keeper is effectively dispersing the colony. As with animal skins, wax becomes available in the early autumn when the hive is broken up, and no more wax is then going to be produced by a colony until the following season, beginning around Easter. The supplies of material for writing, the ink, are also seasonal. Theophilus, the 12th century book expert, reminds scribes that they need to source the tree bark, and he recommends hawthorn, before the tree has flowered, so early spring. We might think also about where book production takes place in a monastery. The cloister, this is the cloister at Furness Abbey in Cumberland, in northwest England. Cloisters seem to have had an early function as a place of reading and also of writing as well. There's a description, a 12th century description of the monastery at Saint-Martin in Tournai, which says that anytime you enter the cloister, you're going to find at least 12 monks sitting at desks copying books. And we know that in some monasteries, and Furness was one of those, which is why I show it, books were kept in cupboards in the cloister. Now, the cloister has the advantage of natural light, but the disadvantage of exposure to wind and cold, and generally also of cluttering up space that's also designed for other uses, perambulation and discussion by the monks. So contemporary illustrations of scribal activity in monasteries tends to show monks or nuns in a purpose-built space, the scriptorium. Larger and wealthier monasteries and convents provided most of the labor and much of the material necessary for manuscript production for most of the medieval millennium. But there's evidence of professional lay scribes and itinerant illuminators from the 12th century onward. And that becomes increasingly common. The picture, there's a couple more scriptoria. The picture begins to change, and we can see this happening, especially in urban monasteries. So we might take as an example of that change from monastic book production to professional external book production. We might take as an example Norwich Cathedral Priory, again, an English example. And I use it because the documentary record marks this change, undramatically, but with some certitude. In 1272, a riot against the monks resulted in the burning of many of the conventual buildings. This is a riot by the townspeople. And so from the 1270s onwards, the obedientiary roles of the priory, the account books kept by the monks who held offices within the monastic community, and these survive very fully from Norwich, these start to record payments for the purchase of materials, especially parchment, from outside the monastery. But we can also see them paying for the parchment to be treated, paying for illumination, and sometimes for copying as well. So we have the influx of professional scribes. And it's noticeable that the district of Norwich closest to the cathedral started in the 14th century to become associated with the book trade as professional parchmenters, scribes, and illuminators move in to occupy buildings in the nearest to the cathedral and monastery. So monasteries such as Norwich are outsourcing activities that had previously been an integral part of the community. And this is a tendency that had already started in university towns such as Paris and Oxford, where professional freelance scribes made no-frills copies used in teaching. Even in a later period, we find some interplay between professional scribes and a monastic community. So a missal made for the Abbot of Westminster, Nicholas Littlington, in the 1380s, by a professional lay scribe who was living in the monastery while working on the book. But he subsequently professed as a monk at Westminster. It's a fascinating little insight into how perhaps scribal skill may have been an inducement on the part of that individual to join the religious life. Gillian mentioned the Morgan Library exhibition on medieval psalters that's currently on. And if you've been to it, you'll probably have seen the historiated Bible from the 1320s made by a husband and wife team of professional scribes, illuminators, Jean and Richard de Montbaston, working in Paris in the 1320s, an example of a real change that's taking place. Okay, I'm going to conclude my sort of brief reflections, and I wanted to finish with some words from Hugh of St. Victor, who's an important thinker and writer of the 12th century. St. Victor was a monastery founded in about 1100 in Paris, in the outskirts of Paris, and always had a reputation for scholarly pursuits. And Hugh is really one of the most important writers and teachers of the period. And one of his books is called The Ark of Noah. And it's an allegorical reference to pedagogical method. And he's reflecting here on the frailty of book production. I quote, "The books that we write are made of the skin of dead animals or some other corruptible material. And as these last only a short time, the books themselves grow old and in their own way are reduced to nothing, leaving no trace of themselves behind." Well, I'd like to think Hugh would be surprised and pleased to know how many manuscripts of his work still survive today. They're not as perishable or corruptible as his rather pessimistic view seemed to indicate. But I think the underlying point there is that for Hugh, the books themselves, the objects are important, but it's the text, it's the words that give life. Well, thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, so we're going to have a bit of conversation, and then we can open up the conversation to the audience. Thank you so much for your stimulating talk and wonderful series of images. The scope of your work, of your book, which spans 12 centuries, is astounding, and you so clearly demonstrate the critical link between the material history of the cloister, the physical reality of the monastery, and the contemplative and intellectual life of the monastery as well, and its evolution. I'd like to dwell on the power of books to start, the power of books, the influence of books over our daily life, seeing where we are right now. And you capture this with the medieval dictum of that compares the monastery without a library to a castle without an arsenal. You make another powerful comparative reference in your book to medieval monasteries as the engine rooms of medieval civilizations. And I know you're referring to things like civil governance and pastoral care, and to agricultural production, but you're also suggesting in both of these comparisons the vital role that the scriptorium played, as you mentioned. And after all, the manuscripts they are what survive to us today and sort of attest to the artistic and theological and intellectual innovations of the period. One of the significant takeaways from the book is the diversity of the forms and experiences of monasticism. This is shown through comparing Eastern and Western forms of monasticism. And I'd like to see if going back to the rule of Benedict helps us to access again the practical world of bookmaking. This is the dominant form of monasticism in the Middle Ages, not just in the West, as you point out in your book, but it also has some influence on Eastern forms. The rule offers spiritual guidance as well as specific instructions on daily life. These are obviously intertwined and not separate things, but it meticulously divides the day and allocates hours for liturgical offices, for the Opus Dei, the work of God, also for meditative reading, as you mentioned, the Lectio Divina is so important, and then also for other manual and contemplative work. And there is this sort of paradox. You mentioned monastic paradoxes, but the paradox inherent in the Benedictine rule of monks relying on the earthly structures of time in order to reach some sort of mystical ascent, which is transcendent and timeless. But I'm wondering if you can elaborate on how this highly regulated division of time, according to the Benedictine rule, shaped the selection and the nature of books that Benedictine monasteries acquired and produced. And also, in connection to that, if we could go back to the arsenal image, how did these books, the arsenal image suggests that the monks relied on books actually to protect themselves, maybe against spiritual listlessness or something else. But how do those books and how does the regimen of the Benedictine rule sort of influence that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting sort of set of things to think about. Yes, I like the way you phrase that. The books provide an arsenal, a protection, and also a kind of a way of framing the monastic day and the job of monks or nuns, and protection against idleness. Idleness is the enemy of the soul, as Benedict says. And books, I think, and reading and writing do two things in Benedict's mind, and also, it should be said, in the minds of other founders and legislators for monasteries. I mean, Benedict is the one whose rule becomes, as you say, Gillian, the most prevalent in Western Europe. But it's important to remember that Benedict himself is drawing on a number of pre-existing rules. And the reason why his rule is so influential is because it's a great work of synthesis. So he's not really inventing things. So he sees reading and writing as doing, I think, two things: as providing a way for the monk or nun to grow spiritually through constant reflection on what they're reading. And that's Lectio Divina, divine, literally kind of sacred reading, is a process of meditative reading, which ensures the monk or nun is engaged in something that is focusing their mind on God. But the writing is, I think, a different process. That's doing something different. And writing is labor. Writing is work. I don't know, has anyone tried to write with a quill on vellum? Probably you have, because you're bibliophiles. It's hard work. It's not like, taking a ballpoint pen and running it over a page. It's actually physical labor in itself. And as you probably know if you've done it, it actually requires, really, you're using your whole arm to do it. It's tiring. It's labor. And it's that kind of labor which is both productive, in Benedict's view, because it's making something that needs to be made. It's making other versions of sacred texts, if it's the Bible that's being copied, or biblical commentaries, or patristic works, whatever. But it's also doing that thing that, going right back to the beginning of monasticism, people thinking about the job of the monk were really concerned about, which is, you don't want a monk or a nun just to be sitting in a cell trying to concentrate on God, because it's actually not possible to do that for most people. You need to be have something to do, some physical work that is using part of your brain, but allowing another part of your brain to be kind of meditative. And I think that's, monks found a solution, a resolution to that problem in writing, in the physical work of writing.
That's really interesting and important to distinguish, I think, between the spiritual value of writing, not just the practical one, and then versus the spiritual value of reading. I do think that the monastic process of reading is also meant to be kind of slow and laborious, right? Because you have this concept of lectio that's not about speed or just absorbing information or even learning it, which I think we can come back to the idea of the university man, but he's more interested in that than the monk who says he can find the meaning of the text later after he memorizes it. And so there's this idea of ruminatio as a slow meditative process of chewing the spiritual text, of chewing the word. And this probably shaped the physical format of books too. I mean, I don't know if you could speak to that.
Well, what I would say is that the monastic life is about repetition. It's about repetition of cycles of doing the same thing over and over again. And you think about, and you're right, things are meant to be read slowly and things are meant to be recited slowly. You think about a monk or a nun is reciting the entire Psalter, so all 150 Psalms during the course of a week. So these are texts that they know very well, but they're saying them together or chanting them together regularly in a cyclical kind of way. And they're not necessarily, when they're engaged in reading, they're not necessarily expected to be reading new things. They're supposed to be, it's perfectly possible for them to be rereading the same text. For example, John Cassian's Conferences, an early 5th century text that Benedict recommends as one of the kind of standard texts that should be in every monastic library about early monks in Egypt. And that's meant to be read again and again and to find something new in all the time. So I think the patterns of reading are intended to mirror the patterns of repetition of sacred texts and to I suppose, reflect the kind of patterns of endless cyclical repetition that is actually part of the monastic life and what makes the monastic life kind of the point of the monastic life, really.
Right. It makes the reading, the lectio, analogous to even like the manual labor, or the manual toil. And I think it's fascinating to think about how these reading practices within the monastery, and I guess also the writing practices, demonstrate the monastic consciousness of one's own fragility too, because reading this way is meant as a distraction. It's meant to fortify oneself against, as you write in your book, against distractions. And the purity of the mind was so key to meditation and to mystical ascent. And so that idea that reading is, right, books are not for mere leisure, but it's part of the spiritual labor that these monks are doing.
But there's another paradox, I think, which is that reading, to us at any rate, is a highly individual pursuit. And Lectio Divina by an individual monk is an individual pursuit. When we read, we tend to do it alone. You find a quiet corner with a book. But actually, the point, that the whole kind of principle behind Benedict's rule is community. And the idea that each monk or nun is a cog in a larger machine. Benedict's not interested. In fact, he wants really he wants individual wills to be suppressed in the interests of the larger communities, the community and the functioning of the community that he's really interested in. And to us, there seems to be a paradox, I think, in the notion of reading which we think of as individual, and the idea of a community. So you've got a load of individuals who are sort of sitting in their corners with their books, and yet they're supposed to be a community. And I think there's something which maybe we can't fully grasp about how they saw Lectio Divina, how they saw reading as maybe something which is more communal. We get some insight into it in what happens in the refectory, where, and this is not just in Benedict's rule, it's also in the Augustinian rule, and you also find it in Greek Orthodox rules as well. It's almost universal in monasticism that monks or nuns eat in silence and are read to. So while they're eating, there's a rota of readers. So there's your daily reader, and they're reading, it could be chapters of the rule itself, it could be a work of patristic or pastoral theology, it could be biblical commentary. But they're listening, they're being read to. So that's, okay, that's reading in community, if you like.
And it relates to the virtue of humility, which is so central to the Benedictine rule, because humility has to do with being close to the earth and with prioritizing the community, so the self becomes absorbed into the community. And that actually brings me to a question about the evolving role of the monastery within the late medieval intellectual landscape, because you discuss in your book how the monastery is instrumental in the revival of learning after the 11th century, but it also lags behind cathedral schools and universities. I mean, university life was vibrant, dynamic, and full of debate. We have the university figures set, the clerics set against the town specifically. We have the rise of towns, the rise of universities. Also, something new and different, I think, from the monastery is the idea that God can now be accessed through reason and logic. Logic is so alluring, rather than lectio divina, rather than a very kind of inaccessible monastic experience of meditative ascent. And so, I'm wondering how the scholarly priorities of a traditional monastery, which are the Opus Dei and the Lectio Divina, differ from the priorities of a university, and how those priorities shaped the books and the book formats, in addition to the kinds of texts that were circulating.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I mean, there is a tension between two styles of learning: the monastic style of learning, which is much more contemplative, which is slow, and which is based on scriptural understanding scripture, commentaries on scripture and so on, and what's going on in the cathedral schools and then the schools which turn into universities, which is about rational inquiry and which relies very heavily on the translations of Aristotle that are taking place across the 12th century. So the introduction of Aristotle, the translations into Latin of Aristotle's works in the 12th century revolutionized the world of learning. Monks are slow to catch on to this, but some monasteries start to engage with universities and actually send monks to university. So both in England and France, you can see this. Monasteries actually setting up monastic colleges in Oxford and to some extent in Paris as well. I mean, where the Musée de Cluny is now was a sort of the Cluniac College, as it were, in Paris, the University of Paris. So they do, by the end of the 13th century, they're starting to want monks to be trained in the universities. And that does actually start to have an influence on monastic learning in the late 13th and into the 14th and 15th centuries. Monks do become more widely educated, I think, in a way in which perhaps they hadn't seen the need for before. You start to see monastic sermons, monastic preaching, whereas back in the 12th century, it had often been thought by monks themselves that that wasn't the job of the monk to preach. But now that they're being educated in university techniques, they start to kind of reshape what they're writing. And there is a kind of revival of monastic learning in the 14th century, but it's rather different in character from previous monastic learning.
And the collections of books are therefore different, right? You have more portable books in university settings and larger format books, and the continuation of patristic commentaries, liturgical books in monasteries versus kind of maybe more radical for the time books about approaching God through dialectics or analytical philosophy.
And the books that are produced by professional scribes in university towns, are really not attractive objects compared to the kind of books that are produced in monasteries, because they're designed to be cheap, they're mass market productions, they're written very, very quickly, often by teams of scribes for students, and often they're really badly written as well. The quality of the hand is poor, they're full of mistakes, they're written, it's almost a kind of assembly line production, and they're designed to be sort of really kind of utilitarian objects. They're horrible compared to these beautiful objects that we associate with monastic libraries.
I think when you start studying the history of the medieval book, this is one misconception that you're suddenly confronted with is that there was just the scriptorium until there wasn't. And in fact, there were centers of commercial book production, especially with the rise of universities, starting in Bologna. And, I think it's really exciting what you're talking about with the way in which monks are relying on professional scribes at some point and itinerant illuminators. I'm thinking, you mentioned Norwich in your talk. And this was a place where you had many different monastic orders working, right, in a more bustling place. I mean, we think of Julian of Norwich as she's an anchoress, she's alone in her cell, and yet she has all of these visitors coming to her. This is a mystic who recorded her visions and the revelations of divine love in late medieval England. But it's really a bustling place. And so this speaks to the diversity of places you consider, of monastic sites you consider in your book. How does the physical landscape and geography of the monastery shape the scriptorium and the books that were circulating, from the isolated desert monastery to the urban monastery and including, a place like Norwich?
Yeah. I mean, we don't think of monasteries as being urban spaces, but they are. A lot of them are. A lot of them are founded in towns, and towns grow up around them. Think of someone like St. Albans or Saint Denis, for example, and they become centers of conurbations. Originally kind of centers of cult, where a shrine of a founding saint is, but they become then centers of commerce as well, and centers of production of various kinds. I mean, the thing we haven't perhaps mentioned, and maybe worth mentioning in the context of urban monasticism, is really, I think, a revolution in religious life in the 13th century, which is the coming of the friars. And the friars, the Dominicans and Franciscans being the best known of these, are professed religious, like monks or nuns, and they live in communities, mostly in towns, but their job, their ministry is outside the communities to people, and they are preachers, and their kind of popularity and the job that they do to supplement and support what parishes are doing, eventually, I think, starts to undermine what monasteries are there for. Part of the tension between a monastery, which is often the biggest and most important landowner and the real power in an urban space or in a surrounding area, the presence of the friars as poor, as not property owning, as ministering to townspeople, really kind of shows up a monastery that's sitting there in isolation, but in the middle of a town and owning most of the town. And so you can see how resentment can build up in that kind of context. Hence the riot against in the town of Norwich, which actually ends up burning the scriptorium, which is why they then start to outsource their work.
And then there's also, of course, in the late medieval and 13th century onward, the shift from, spirituality within the monastery to a more lay piety, and given that shift and the rise of vernacular literature, vernacular spiritual texts, we also have you showed the image of Hildegard dictating her vision to a male scribe, which I think makes us wonder about the role of women in relation to the book, and monastic women in particular, enclosed women. I mean, given the proliferation of religious houses for women after the conquest, and in England, but really everywhere, and then also the rise in extra monastic forms of spirituality. How do we think about women's roles in the circulation of books, either enclosed within monastic settings or outside wandering, like the begging?
Like in beguinages. I mean, women are undoubtedly doing a lot of book copying, and really I think we've only just started to kind of learn about the extent to which nuns are really important in this work as well, as male monks. And there are, of course, professional scribes who are women. You think about one of the most famous women writers of the later Middle Ages, Christine de Pizan. I mean, she, by her own, well, according to her own claim, was a terrific scribe. She could write much quicker than probably almost anyone else at the time. She had to, because that's how she earned money to support her family after her husband died. But yeah, I think we probably haven't even started to know, what percentage of copying is actually done by women in convents.
She is a remarkable example. I mean, she had children and she lost the financial support from her husband, and then her father dying, and then she ends up, it's really remarkable what she achieves. And then there are all the changes in spiritual texts being read by women, and the fact that Julian's texts are preserved by Carthusians and wealthy abbesses as patrons of books, psalters and books of hours, rather than sort of traditional monastic books.
And that's another factor that we perhaps haven't talked about, which is the rise of lay literacy, which is really important in the later Middle Ages, and therefore the desire, the need of pious lay people to own devotional books that they can look at themselves, that they can read, and that they can kind of meditate on the images as well. So the Book of Hours is basically a devotional psalter, which has the Psalms, but it has other prayers as well in it, and it's designed to give a sort of a do-it-yourself way of carrying out your own personal private devotions. But we know that very often books of hours or psalters are commissioned by husbands and wives together, and so we have to kind of imagine or reconstruct the pious household where books are at the center of a kind of a sort of family devotion in a way that's really new, I think, from the 13th, 14th centuries onwards.
And I wonder if from psalters we can also learn a little bit more about the individual monk's personal, spiritual, intellectual life, because if we take something as early as 1124, the St. Alban Psalter and Christina of Markiate, I mean, this is an example of a text, of a manuscript that does give us something about the life of a real, like a historical person. We have this wonderful image of Christina of Markiate in the manuscript, guiding male monks to Christ, sort of unique intercessory role.
It's a really interesting dynamic. Christina of Markiate was an anchoress who escaped a marriage that her family had arranged for her, and attempted sexual assault in order to force her into that married life. ran away, was befriended by groups of male and female hermits, and eventually founded her own community of Markiate. But she was also kind of supported by the abbot of St. Albans, which is the nearby male monastery, a monastery of virtually unparalleled power and influence in England at the time. And yet the abbot was clearly very, very influenced by Christina's spirituality. It's a really remarkable kind of episode, I think, in the kind of the male-female monastic dynamic there.
I mean, you mentioned there's a lot more work to be done on monastic women copyists. There is a conference being held at St. Gall, the Abbey of St. Gall next June, which is focused on the Library of Shell, and I think that's 7th to 9th century, but women in scriptoria. So that's really, really interesting. I know we can open things up. I do have an important question, which is, before we do that, which is, well, first, I would love to know, and I'm sure the audience would love to know, what your favorite medieval library is, a monastic library is. But in addition, thinking about the end of this history, the rise in print, how did monasteries and scriptoria grapple with the printing press? Did the scribe disappear? Were there printing presses in monasteries? Were they sort of capitalizing on this? How were they engaging with books differently at that point in the late 15th century?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I suppose printing presses are obviously made possible by a new technology, but they're also made possible by the increasing introduction of paper rather than vellum or parchment. I mean, paper was always around, well, it was around from the early Middle Ages, but it wasn't widely used. I think there's one of I forget which monastic library catalogue, in around 1200, I think about 20% of the books are specified as being written on paper rather than parchment. Now, you can print on parchment, but it's hard work. It's much easier to print on paper. So, in a way, printing is is also facilitated by the increasing use of paper and the establishment of paper mills.
Does it have the same spiritual value for a monk?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't think it does. Yeah. And I think that there's something about, I quoted Hughs and Victor, the books that we write are made on the skin of dead animals. There's something about using animal skin rather than using plant fiber to write on that seems to have kind of had spiritual value, but also that people realized that actually parchment was more long-lasting, was more durable. And that's one reason why actually royal governments prefer to use parchment for its record keeping rather than paper, because they thought that they didn't really trust paper's kind of sort of capacity for endurance, I suppose. What happens to, I mean, if you look at, as you will know, when you look at early printed books, they're still kind of, using the same grid, same lines as they are, as scribes were. So there is a kind of a process of transition, which it's not, you suddenly have printing and therefore scribes are no longer needed. There is that kind of transitional process. But I guess once printing starts to kind of sweep everything before it, it's really a continuation of the professionalization of the scribe that we were talking about. And I'm avoiding the question about my favorite monastic library. I don't know. I don't know. St. Gall would have to be up there, I suppose. Yeah.
Right. That's a good one.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll stop there and open up the questions audience. Okay. Great. We have a microphone here. Sorry. Yeah. Oh, here. I just in the second. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much for a very interesting talk and then conversation. interested in illustration. So a lot of there's been, obviously your concentration has been on the word and writing the word, but then clearly illumination and illustration. I'm wondering, if this is sort of within your remit, the degree to which clearly later on there's concern about imagery, but it seems as though I wonder what their conception of imagery is and the production of it, and how much it is believed to sort of help intensify an experience versus distract, because clearly later on there's obviously enormous ambivalence about the image.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. There is ambivalence. I think there are different, famously Bernard of Clairvaux, 12th century monk and the most famous of the Cistercians, a reformer, is very against imagery of all kinds. So early Cistercian books were not supposed to be illuminated. The Cistercians were not supposed to have paintings on the walls of their churches or any kind of fancy decoration or sculpture and so on. And in a famous text from the 1120s, he rails against imagery, especially kind of fantastic sculpted imagery in monastic cloisters. But at the same time, there are other people who would call themselves reformers who don't have a problem with imagery. And I mentioned Hugh of St. Victor, the Victorines, the monastery of St. Victor on the outskirts of Paris. We don't know what sculpted images it had because the church was destroyed. But manuscripts that survive, it's clear that imagery is being used as an explicatory tool, as part of the process of biblical commentary. And I think there is definitely a lot of that. The famous quote that art is the Bible of the illiterate has been kind of repeated endlessly, but I think it's not just that. Visual culture of book production is there not because people can't read, it's there to enhance and give value to the word as well. But yeah, I think images are an integral part of kind of textual reproduction.
You have someone like Matthew Paris too in St. Albans who's illustrating his own. He's a scribe and illuminator for his own.
Drawing elephants and things like that in his text. Yeah.
Are there any monasteries and monks today who are preparing these manuscripts the old-fashioned way?
Yes, there are. I don't know if I can. There are certainly still scribes that work in some monasteries. I don't know if there are any in. You probably know. People in the audience probably know better than I would if there are any in the United States where scribes are at work. But there are some certainly in Europe where there are some monastic scribes at work in England, for example. Yeah. So they're not doing it in the same or for the same purpose as medieval monks would have been. These are sort of commissioned works of art, really, as much as anything else. But it's still a practice which continues.
Thank you. This was a marvelous talk. I wanted to ask if sort of a two-part question. Did the monasteries share their books at all with people outside of the monastery system? And related to that, what, in round numbers, what would be the literacy rate in the general population in those times?
Really interesting question. Do they share their books? I'm going to slightly dodge that one by saying that there are quite a lot of examples of monks having epistolary correspondence with people outside the monastery. So friendship circles, particularly amongst kind of the lay aristocracy. So this is a feature of some 11th, 12th century monks that they would create a friendship circle through letter writing, through having pen pals, if you like. Are they actually lending their books? I actually don't know. I need to. That's a very interesting question. I need to look into that. The literacy rate is probably, well, some historians think that by the 12th century it's already greater than we used to think. That certainly amongst the aristocracy, there are. I mean, there are famous descriptions of kings like Henry II of England in the 1160s, who's, oh yeah, he can read, and other, kings and important people who need to be able to, or are expected to be able to read, not just devotionally, but because they need to be able to read, business documents. They're creating records as an instrument of power, and they're therefore able to read. I think the big difference actually is we tend to think of literacy as being able to read and write. Whereas I think in the Middle Ages, functional literacy was you could read, but writing was a different matter. Famously, Einhard, in his biography of Charlemagne, says that Charlemagne, he was taught to read as an adult, and he was quite good, says Einhard, but he had difficulty forming his letters because he'd started too late in life. So I think writing was seen as something that you weren't necessarily expected to be able to do. But reading, yeah, it's on the increase, but it's probably starting to be more widespread than certainly amongst the aristocracy from the 12th century onwards.
So who was your average monk or nun? And how did that shift at all through the centuries? I'm thinking, like the second or third son went into the military. Did the fourth go to a monastery because they were never going to get any money? But on the other hand, daddy would support the monastery in which was feeding them and so forth.
Yeah, very important point. For most of the Middle Ages, at least in Western Europe, it's less obvious in Eastern monasticism, but certainly in Western Europe, for most of the Middle Ages, monasticism is an aristocratic profession, both for men and women, by which I mean not that they are members of the peerage, not dukes or counts or whatever, but monks and nuns tend to come from landowning families. So they tend to come from the elite, powerful families. And it's exactly as you suggest, there's a dynamic of a productive relationship between the monastery and the powerful local families. That starts to change toward the later Middle Ages. By the 14th century, you've got more, I should say, maybe more ordinary people becoming monks. It tends to be with a kind of rise of an urban middle class in England, France, Germany, Italy. Monasticism tends could draw from those classes as well. So I think I'd say from about 1300, just to kind of pick a slightly arbitrary date, that's starting to change. But up till that point, it's an aristocratic profession.
And the rise of mendicant orders, too. I mean, that means that people are invited into, well, not in, right? Not to an enclosure, but you could be walking around. And,
sure. Yeah.
Thank you very much to you both. I have two questions, if that's okay. The first one's a bit technical, but with the production of manuscript books, I was always wondered, when thinking about the cover or the animal skins and its preparation, when thinking about the binding and the covering materials, I've always been told you have to use a treated skin. If you're using calf, you have to tan it to become leather, so it's not corruptible. But then for the parchment, is it just because it's been pared so finely that it's incorruptible? Because from what I understand, it doesn't get treated in any specific way. And then the second question is very different. We know there were communities of women in monastic cultures that were involved in book production. We know that there were women in monastic cultures, in text production, like Marjorie Kemp and Julian of Norwich. But I was wondering if you've come across any evidence of anchorites involved in book production specifically. Were they able to be a part of that communal practice of producing the manuscript itself?
Yeah, interesting. On the first question, on the technical production and treatment, that's not my expertise, I'm afraid. So, I mean, they're certainly using, as I'm sure you in the audience would know, they're certainly using imperfect skins. So we've all kind of probably seen examples of where there are holes in the skin in the parchment, and sometimes there are attempts to repair it, stitch things together. They are. I'm not sure what the to be honest, what the technical treatment of parchment would be, or whether it's always the same. But they are scraping off the hairs, and of course we've also probably all seen examples where you can tell the difference in the hair side and the smooth side of a folio. So it's not a perfect process. The question of anchorites, yes, there are examples. I know of some certainly in the Eastern Mediterranean. There are hermits, or solitary monks, who are making, supporting themselves through copying texts, copying books, and that there are examples of that in the later medieval West as well. So yeah, it's one of the things that one does find. Yeah.
My brain's on fire. Now I'm thinking about the hermits, and I keep thinking about the line in the Tom Stoppard play that I didn't realize that there's a famous line, a hermit that reads the newspapers is not a hermit in whom one can have complete confidence, right? I had no idea that these hermits were earning money and socializing, and how does that get documented? How does that play out?
So, hermits have to support themselves somehow. I mean, being a hermit or an anchorite involves a kind of dependence on outside society. There's a paradox there, because you need someone to, whether you're on top of a pillar, well, especially if you're on top of a pillar like Simi in the Starlight, you're completely dependent on a community to feed you, basically. Now, if you're a hermit in a cell or a cave or whatever, you can grow some of your own food and so on, but you need a bit of money to support yourself as well. So there are examples of that. I mean, my favorite example is a hermit who lived on the banks of the River Jordan in the Holy Land, who is described in a 12th century pilgrimage account as having a tame lion. And there were lions. We know there were lions in that region in the 12th century. And this one he had tamed. And the lion used to bring him bits of wood, and he would then carve them into crosses. The hermit would carve them into crosses to sell to pilgrims. And that's how he would support himself. So he'd then sort of use the money to buy food, I guess, for himself. So.
And my other question is, do you see the beginnings of criticism, book criticism? Do you see people's references to, don't hire that scriptorium, they're terrible, hire this guy? Do you see that kind of backbiting and business sabotage early on, or not really?
Really good question. Well, you certainly see writers criticizing each other. Whether they're criticizing each other's the quality of the actual hand or the book production, I really don't know, but one would like to think so, yes.
Well, just adding on the first point about the paradox of being enclosed and yet reliant on the community. The Anchoritic manual in the 13th century on Lusa is also, it's a male author speaking to a community of women who are enclosed. And he's, on one hand, he's reminding us that these women are essentially in tombs. And Anchoritic cells were sometimes in a graveyard, so they were reminded that their bodies were closed off, and sometimes anchoresses would go through funerary processions, as a metaphor for being dead to the world. And then on the other hand, he's incredibly anxious about their potential for life and for community and talking to each other through the window. And so there is this really fascinating paradox about enclosure and community. Yeah.
Thank you. So the scriptorium, primarily these are copyists creating text for distribution or use. Are there examples of illuminations being copied or areas where this is happening?
Yeah. Again, I don't want to pretend to be an art historian when I'm not, but we do know that there are model books that illuminators have and use, that there are kind of books of samples. So sometimes they're copying styles from other manuscripts they might have seen, or from wall paintings, for example. But we do know that there are artists' copybooks that circulate, and that that you can presumably borrow. And this comes back to the kind of the roving illuminators who are being employed at a monastery for a particular commission or something. The scribe is not always the same as the illuminator, of course. Sometimes they are, like you mentioned Matthew Paris, Gillian, but sometimes, very, very often, the illuminator would be someone brought in, and so the scribe is writing the page and leaving a space for the illuminator to come in. The illuminator might be another monk to come in and use the little square that's been left or whatever to do the illumination. But they're certainly they're not. There might be a degree of invention, but they're both styles and iconographies are circulating in similar ways to the actual texts that they're being copied are circulating.
Okay, I think Christian's not one. Yeah. Okay.
I love asking the last question to wrap this up. What in heaven's name do students make out of the concept of laborious reading, laborious writing, right? When you actually have to focus, or repetition, right? How do they react when you describe this world to them?
Well, I don't know about you, Gillian, but they... the monastic world is very alien to most of us today. I think certainly.
But this is learning by heart. This is where it came from. Like the idea of taking the text and putting it in your heart and your memory, and the memory and the heart, were so connected in the Middle Ages and medieval imagination. But I don't know how many people do that kind of rote memorization anymore, or just ruminating over a text without trying to analyze it quickly. Which there's so much pressure to do, like analyze quickly, but there's a different world that opens up when you just do that meditative chewing on the text.
I suspect I'm not the only one in the audience who had to learn reams of poetry by heart as a child in school, most of which I've forgotten. But that's slightly different. In a way that kind of draws upon ancient and medieval ideas of kind of keeping text, in yourself, and keeping it in mind. And that's something which is very familiar and necessary for medieval people, particularly in monasteries and convents, needing to be able to recite the whole Psalter by heart and so on. But I think we've got out of the habit of that because it's about how much you can read now, isn't it? And actually, we don't really help our students in the sense that we sort of say, okay, well, the assignment for next week is to read this chapter and this journal article and this book and so on. We're giving them quantities, and it's, you know, saying get through all of this rather than saying, look, here's 5 pages which I want you to read and actually think about and reflect on and read again and again and really.
I mean, that's close reading, though. Some of us try to teach that, and also like, sometimes I will give my students a 2-page essay to write rather than a 20-page one because I want it to be really good. And if it's 2 pages, maybe they'll turn, you know, the quality is so much more than the quantity. So it's a good question. Okay, thank you so much for coming. Thank you to...
Well, thank you. Thank you. It's a lot of fun.
Okay.
Yeah.